Padua, the city of frescoes, is home to an outstanding number of 14th century fresco cycles, which form the basis of its recognition by UNESCO to feature among the world's great heritage sites. The frescoes, which can be found in this historic city, are an extraordinary example of the creative genius of man, as shown in the works of Giotto and of the artists who followed his lead during the 14th century. After working in Assisi, Giotto worked in Padua in the Basilica of St. Anthony, an international place of worship and a pivotal monument in art history. The Madonna Mora Chapel, St. Anthony's original burial site, may feature long disregarded traces of one of the earliest Paduan works by the Tuscan master. Meanwhile, the chapter room, another space of crucial importance for the life of the convent, holds undisputable proof of Giotto's frescoes with scenes related to St. Francis, Franciscan saints, and parts of a great crucifixion. In the chapel, where thousands of blessings are still asked and granted on a daily basis, we can find figures of saints enclosed in frames very similar to those which will be repeatedly used by Giotto. It is no coincidence that this chapel was under the patronage of the family that would soon thereafter commission him to paint his masterpiece, the Scrovegni Chapel. Giotto organized the space in a rational painted architecture that comprises, as the history of salvation, the events of the lives of Christ and of the Virgin Mary, leading the visitor to the majestic vision of the great Last Judgment. The narrative begins from the lunette at the top of the triumphal arch, with God ordering the Archangel Gabriel to commence the redemption of mankind, and unfolds along the walls of the nave in 3 successive tiers that descend in a spiral. They tell the story of Joachim and Anna, the birth of their child, Mary, her wedding to Joseph, the Nativity, and the stories of Jesus, his sacrifice on the cross, his resurrection, and ascension. The monochrome paintings with the vices and virtues remind the faithful how choosing to follow one path or the other will lead, when the last judgment comes, either to hell or to heaven. Under the Eternal, Enrico Scrovegni offers a model of the chapel to the Virgin Mary, who is flanked by St. Catherine and St. John. He is the banker for whom Giotto painted the frescoes to celebrate his household among the city's leading families. For the first time ever, we can observe such a close bond between artist and client. It is the beginning of a revolutionary path that will project itself across the history of painting. To this day, the Eremitani Church still bears copious evidence of this extraordinary artistic season. Part of its apse still preserves the stories of St. Philip, St. James, and St. Augustine, where Guariento continues the spatial experimentation introduced to Padua by Giotto. It is the same empirical, intuitive perspective that will also interest Giusto di Menabuoi, another Florentine painter who worked in the church of the Eremitani. In just a few years, the middle-class merchant clients became sophisticated, aristocratic clients who cultivated the intention to bring the sacred episode up to date by involving their contemporaries. In the chapel of the Carraresi Palace, Guariento paints the characters of the Old Testament clad and adorned in 14th century fashion. As a result, paintings become not just evidence of an elegant lifestyle in lavish surroundings, but also a means of celebrating power. The most important female art patron of the Paduan court is Fina Buzzaccarini, the wife of Francesco the Elder da Carrara. She commissioned Giusto to paint the baptistery, thus contributing to the creation of one of the greatest masterpieces of Italian painting. In the triumphal arch of the Scrovegni Chapel, Giotto painted two fake architectural spaces surmounted by a cross vault. It was an absolute novelty, two empty rooms without any human figures, which allowed the master to demonstrate his ability with perspective by making it the main focus. Giusto reinterprets the spatiality of the Scrovegni frescoes by placing himself halfway between Giotto's pursuit of realism and Altichiero da Zevio's illusionistic perspective, which extends the real architecture with the painted one. Altichiero, together with Jacopo Avanzi, decorated the Chapel of St. James in the Basilica del Santo with paintings that pierce through the reality of the architectural structure. His client was Bonifacio Lupi di Suragna, a member of the same family of military leaders linked to the Carraresi court. He will also commission Altichiero to fresco the nearby oratory of St. George. 70 years later, the Scrovegni Chapel was still the model to follow, in architecture as well as in the composition of the scenes, larger but still organized in successive tiers. Within the setting of an ideal Gothic city, episodes from the life of St. George, St. Catherine, and St. Lucy are juxtaposed with scenes from the life of Christ, in a narrative that pursues the research on space and emotions begun by Giotto. Beside man, it is 14th century Padua that takes center stage in Giotto's city view in the chapel of the Blessed Luca Belludi in the Basilica of St. Anthony. The Basilica, the walls, the Palazzo della Ragione, the Carrarese Palace, and the castle with its Torlonga, which has since become an astronomical observatory known as La Specola. The nearby oratory of St. Michael, resulting from the extension of an earlier sacred building, is where Pietro di Bartolomeo de' Bovi called to work Jacopo da Verona, a former helper of Altichiero. Jacopo showed his outstanding skills as a portrait artist by capturing his client's family in the procession of the Adoration of the Magi, with Francesco the Elder and Francesco Novello da Carrara. Whereas Giotto, Guariento, Giusto, and Altichiero had painted their contemporaries to portray and celebrate them, here they go all the way as to impersonate the characters of sacred history. But it was not just the Scrovegni and the Franciscan friars who commissioned Giotto to paint in Padua. The Comune hired him to decorate the Palazzo della Ragione, seat of the civil and commercial courts, and still the beating heart of the city to this day. The chronicles mention an extraordinary cycle of astrological paintings, until a terrible fire that broke out a century later wiped them away forever. The same theme was revived 1 century later, and it is what we can admire today, a huge cycle on judicial astrology, describing the influence of the planets on the lives and the disputes of men. It is perhaps no coincidence that Giotto was called to decorate the Palace of Earthly Judgment shortly after painting the Divine Judgment in the Scroveny Chapel. In his Hell, the narrative develops through images of strong realism that aroused fear and terror in the men of the time. Figures of devils and of the damned were rendered with broad and confident brushstrokes in dark colors, in stark contrast to the light that shines through the clear colors of paradise. At about the same time, Giotto di Bondone, through fresco painting, and Dante Alighieri, in poetry, were inaugurating that magnificent century that were the 1300s.
Lo duca e io, per quel cammino ascoso intrammo, a ritornar nel chiaro mondo, e senza cura aver d'alcun riposo salimmo su, e il primo e io secondo, tanto che vidi delle cose belle che porta il ciel per un pertugio tondo, e quindi uscimmo a riveder le stelle.